Hey, it's Checkmate with another how-to tutorial for Die in the Dungeon. In this video, I'll give you a rundown of every dice type, mod, and upgrade in the game. I'll link in the description to my Steam guide, which I will keep up to date on any changes or additions to the game. Please be sure to like the video and subscribe for more Die in the Dungeon tutorials. There's a good deal of information in the game itself in the Codex, which you will fill out as you unlock dice and encounter them in the dungeon. However, knowing how to use these dice and how to craft your deck will help you survive and conquer the dungeon. Let's go over the different dice shapes first. There are D4s, D6s, and D8s, which refers to how many faces are on the dice. In addition to having different numbers of faces, they also have different energy costs. D4 dice cost 0 energy and generally roll low faces by default. The max face value you can have is 4. The D6 costs 1 energy, and the max face value of these is 6. The D8s cost 2 energy. They generally have higher faces by default, and their max face value can be 8. Now let's go over the dice types. I'll go ahead and try to separate these into categories to make it a little easier to follow along, but the number of dice in the full version of the game is much higher than in Classic or even in Origins, the earlier demos. First, let's go over the different attack dice. The basic attack just deals its value and damage to the targeted enemy. The splash attack will deal its value as damage to the target enemy and will also deal 50% of its final value to the other enemies. Lethal attack deals its damage to the enemy, and if that enemy is killed, it damages for the same amount the next enemy. The effect doesn't change, the effect fires only once, so if your lethal attack kills the second enemy, it's not going to overflow also onto the third. Puncture attack dice deals the final value and damage to the target enemy, and if the enemy has block, then it will deal double damage. The area attack deals damage to all the enemies. Poison applies the final value as a poison modifier to the target enemy. The poison stacks deal their value and damage to the enemy at the end of the enemy turn. Then the stack decreases by 1. Next, let's talk about block dice. Block dice apply defense to the player. The barrier dice applies the final value as barrier stacks to the player. The barrier stacks apply that value to the player as defense at the start of the player's turn. The stacks have and value at the end of each turn. Thorns applies the final value as thorn stacks to the player. Thorns doesn't actually give you defense, but instead it counterattacks enemies who attack you. Thorns returns damage based on the amount of attack that the enemies deal to you. Thorn stacks are removed at the start of the player's turn based on the amount of damage dealt back to enemies. So for instance, if a fly enemy were to attack you with 3 damage, Thorns would counterattack that fly for 3 damage back. And then that next turn, the thorn stacks would decrease by 3. Let's talk about heal dice. The heal die increases the player's health by its final value, and the regen die applies its final value as regen stacks to the player. Regen increases the player's HP by the amount of that stack after the enemy's attack at the end of the turn, and then the stacked value halves. Boost dice are among some of the more powerful dice in the way that they interact across the board. Boost targets dice as many spaces away as the face of that die. It gives dice X spaces away an increase of X in final value, where X is the face of that die. You can't boost other boost die with boost. So for instance, a boost die of 2 will give 2 extra value to all the dice that are 2 spaces away from that boost die. Sticky boost is similar to boost, except that the die that is boosted keeps that boost as a bonus value whenever it is played for the rest of the fight. Close boost boosts the dice that are next to it by the amount of its own face. This is especially powerful to give higher boost numbers like 6s or 7s or even 8s, but does it to dice that are directly next to the close boost, rather than being 7 or 8 spaces away. The terrain dice boosts the tile it's on by its final value. The terrain boost on the board decreases by 1 per turn. The terrain dice themselves are not affected by terrain boost in the board, but they are affected by other boost dice that target it. Next is a very powerful group of dice. The mirror dice are very powerful. Mirrors target other dice and copy those dice and their final value. Mirrors targeting other mirrors do nothing, but this is a really powerful way to double the amount of heal or block or defense you get. You can also mirror other boosts to create additional boost spots. Offensive mirror is similar to mirror, but instead of copying its target dice themselves, it copies the target dice values and adds them as attack value to the targeted enemy. Defensive Mirror is also similar, but it copies its target dice values as defense to the player. Nurturing Mirror is again similar, but it copies its target dice values as heal to the player. Prism dice are not technically mirrors, but it functions very similarly. It projects any boost it receives onto the dice that it targets. When a mirror die targets the prism die, all the dice that the prism targets are also copied by that mirror. Prism is one of the most complex and powerful dice in the game. The reroll dice target dice as well. The dice that reroll targets are rerolled when the reroll dice is played. Say that 10 times fast. This is helpful when you roll a low number and want a chance to roll a higher number. This can be helpful if your dice roll a low number, but have a good chance of rolling a higher number if you were to reroll them again. This also has a lot of cool synergies with some other relics that deal with reroll, such as High Ground, and you can use reroll dice to reroll the value of a heavy dice that's already locked to the board to keep it on the board longer. Draw dice gives its final value in bonus stacks to the player. Bonus stacks decrease by 1 each time the player uses the draw button. Blood dice deal its final value in damage to the player, but also applies 1 might stack to the player. Might stacks do not decrease the entire fight, and increase all attack dice by its value. The Energizer die gives its final value in Energizer stacks to the player. Energizer decreases by 1 each turn and gives the player 1 extra energy for that turn. Coin dice often spawn in this class. The way coin works is if the final value of the coin die is 5 or more, the player gets 6 coins immediately. This can be super helpful in breaking the economy. This can be super helpful to get more coins so that you can buy relics and mods in the shops. The Fortify die operates similarly. If the final value of this die is 10 or more, give the player the Fortify modifier. This modifier allows block to remain after the end of the turn. Similarly, if the final value of the Backstab dice is 10 or more, give the player the Backstab modifier. This Backstab modifier allows all attack to ignore enemy defense and damage the HP directly. The Hollower dice grants the Hollow property to the dice that it targets for the remainder of the fight. Dice that target Void have their energy cost reduced to 0. Its final value is dealt as damage to the player. Next, let's talk about the properties on dice, or the modifiers. You can find them randomly generated on dice in battle rewards, or you can get them as a result of events, or you can buy them from the shops or the forge. Dice with the flash modifier are played instantly. This has some odd interactions with heavy and gravity, but can be very powerful in other situations. This could allow you to get defense before the end of your turn, or it can be put on reroll dice to reroll the dice that are already on the board before actually committing to end your turn. You can also use it in conjunction with terrain. Putting flash on terrain will create the terrain boosted spot that you can use still in that very turn. You can also use it to play a flash dice on the terrain spot to get that boost immediately from terrain, and then play another dice on it to get that terrain boost again twice. When you play glass dice, they are exiled, and you cannot play them for the rest of the fight. Grow is a very simple but powerful property. The final value of dice with Grow is increased by 1 every time it is played. Dice with the heavy property are locked on the board when they're played. Its face value then decreases by 1 each turn it is on the board. When the face hits 0, the heavy die is discarded. When you put Hollow on dice, its energy costs are reduced by 1. Dice can't have a negative energy cost, so Hollow doesn't do much on the D4 types that already cost 0 energy. There are certain dice that generate in with the faulty modifier. The face values of these dice cannot be edited, and properties can also not be added or removed on faulty dice. The double dip modifier is very helpful for deck management. When a dice with double dip is drawn, another die is drawn. Dice with the retry modifier may be rerolled once in the player's hand until they're played. When a dice has the Pointy modifier, it will deal 1 damage to the player when played. The toxic modifier applies 2 stacks of poison to the targeted enemy when it is played. Dice that have pack will gain an extra +2 for every other die on the board with the same type. The group modifier is similar. This die will get an extra +1 value for every other die that's placed adjacent to it on the board. A die with gravity is locked on the board when it is played. Each subsequent turn, it moves 1 spot lower on the board. When it drops off the board, it returns to the player's hand. The die's face is not re-rolled, so keep this in mind when you initially play a gravity die. Its face value will stay that way. Finally, when you have dice with the retain property, they stay in the player's hand and are not discarded at the end of the turn. Now that we covered all the properties, let's talk about the other way that you can improve dice, by upgrading their tier. There are basic, silver, and gold dice that get progressively stronger. Basic dice are in the starting decks, and most rewards will be basic tier. These are low values, like a D4 will roll generally 0s to 1s, a D6 will roll 1s, 2s, or 3s, and a basic D8 die can roll anywhere from 2 to 6. Dice can be upgraded to silver at the forge from basic tier. Dice are given points equal to their shape to add to any face. So D4 will have 4 points that you can allocate to any combination of faces, D6 has 6, and D8 has 8. Dice can be upgraded from silver to gold at the forge, starting in area 2. Dice are given points equal to their shape again to add to any face. You can also redistribute the faces at a forge or at the campfires. You can rearrange or remove the face values based on points equal to their shape. D4, D6, D8. There are certain events that will also change or add dice value for some very powerful custom dice, such as dice that only roll 3s, or dice that go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 across their faces, or can just add +1 value to every face on the dice. Also, some enemies will use dice that you'll encounter. There's the bee honey dice. These dice are used by the queen bee boss and the worker bee enemies. Dice that are targeted by honey dice have their values cut in half. When boost dice target these dice, the corresponding enemy will receive an attack boost for the rest of the fight. The dice are not locked on the board, so you can move them around as the player. The ant present dice are used by the ant enemy and are locked to the board. They prevent players from using the tiles that they occupy. When boost dice target these dice, the corresponding enemy receives an attack boost for the rest of the fight. The sneak dice must be targeted with a die for the sneaky enemy to appear and be targeted by the player. Then there's also sting dice. These glass dice are used by the Mosquito Duke boss. They deal their final value as damage to the player and heal to the boss. They also have the retain property, so they'll stay in your hand and you'll have to manage your deck around them. I hope this field guide is helpful in your journeys in the dungeon. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit the like button, and hey, check out some of my other videos for more guides or speedruns or just some good gameplay.